Wednesday, August 19th. Welcome back to SamCentre. I'm your host, Sam. And as always, we're talking football on Wednesday's show, specifically college football. Coach Sam will be here in just a moment to break down his thoughts on the AP and coaches preseason top 25 poll leading into week 0 in the college football season. He's also going to break down the top 4 teams that he has in the SEC conference. Don't fret. Later on in the week, he's going to be back with his dedicated breakdown. 2 different videos we're thinking, one on the top 25 in greater detail, and then another one obviously breaking down the SEC conference the same way he did the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the Big 12. College football week 0 is almost here. The NFL preseason continues to roll. CFL week 12 is about to get into action. We're going to talk power rankings, standings, and the matchups heading into the week. If you're new around here, I'd love it if you subscribed, and let's run the intro.
But what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything? But what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be?
When you break down the top 25, let's just get into it. First things first, the Associated Press, their top 25. I'll put it up on screen right there. The only real differences as far as the press and the coaches poll, which I'll put up in just a moment, is LSU and Alabama. They do have them flipped. In the press poll, they have them at 11, and then in the coaches poll that we'll throw up right now, they have them there at 13. Ultimately, when you look at who received first place votes, I think this is where it really comes into play with what the public thinks and then what the coaches think. With the public, they were really high on a team like Oregon. The press decided they got 14 first place votes. Whereas on the flip side, in the coaches poll, they got 6 first place votes. The defending champions, Indiana, ranked number 6 on both sides, but the difference in the level of respect shown to Curt Cignetti, 14 first place votes on the coaches' side, whereas on the AP poll, the press, 6. So that's to me the biggest thing. Oregon and Indiana essentially flipped as far as what the coaches think and depending what the press thinks. You know, you look at the standing wise, they stay the same, and this is preseason. You know, this is why we do this. It's fun to talk about. It's the dog days of summer. We really want week 0 to come, and we talked about it on the 29th of August. We're going to have some football back. But let's get into the poll. So number 1, obviously Ohio State on both sides, and I think that's pretty well deserved. You know, we talked about it in our Big Ten breakdown. Pedigree on both sides of the ball as far as NFL level coordinators. There's NFL level talent on this team every single year. The thing that concerns me a little bit about them, and if we look at the schedule here, week 2 at Texas, that's going to be a big game. Can they gel immediately? I think so with Ohio State. A new offensive coordinator, but returning a lot of the same guys, returning Julian Sayin there at quarterback, Bo Jackson at running back. They have Jeremiah Smith at wide receiver, who might be the best non-quarterback in all of college football. They have a good offensive line. I imagine Ohio State is going to be up for that challenge, but Texas is going to be looking to get back their defeat from last year. So that's going to be a big game in week 2. Other big games I circled on their schedule that could really determine, the top 25 and what it looks like there. Because I think Ohio State, likelihood for them, their ceiling is going to be playoff team. I can't imagine anything out of there. That's what the expectation is over here. They have to go on the road to Iowa. And then check out this couple game stretch. Indiana, at USC, and then versus Oregon. So at home versus Oregon. Last game of the season, they go to Michigan. So when you start to look at this schedule, do you see a potential for 3 losses? Because I do. And so now if we're starting to talk about a lot of these teams in the SEC, so this is going to be partial SEC breakdown, partial top 25 breakdown, Because as you look at this top 25 poll, 7 out of the top 13 teams here are obviously from the SEC. And the parity in the SEC this year is going to be massive. Because of a 9-game conference slate instead of an 8-game conference slate, to me, that's going to be the big equalizer. Are we going to see a lot of these teams at 9-3? We'll talk about it in a moment. So then if Ohio State ends up losing 3 games, let's say the losses are a combination of Michigan and Indiana, one of those two. Let's say Oregon gets you and Texas gets you. You're able to defeat USC, Iowa, and then one of either Indiana and Michigan. Is that good enough for them to be one of the top 12 teams? I don't know. Time is going to tell. And the same thing for Oregon, obviously ranked number 2 on both sides. And the difference is what we talked about as far as what the coaches and the press thought about them. In the coaches poll, they received 6 first place votes, and in the press poll, they received 14. To me, Oregon, if you just look at pure roster, in my opinion, it's them or Texas for who has the best roster on paper. This team is loaded at every single position. Dan Lanning, I think, it's time for him to start to win these big games. We talked about them in our breakdown that Oregon really only loses to the teams that go on to play for the national championship game. But at a certain point, that needs to be you. You need to be that team that comes through in the big game and wins and plays for the national championship. So, looking at their schedule, start off with a couple pretty tough games, in my opinion. Boise State at home, and then at Oklahoma State. And when I break down the difference in who received votes in these polls, Boise State in the press poll received 43 votes, and they didn't make the top 25, as you can see. However, in the coaches poll, they received 24 votes as well. So ultimately, a team that's respected, a team that is probably one of the top teams outside of this, power conferences, outside of the big conferences. I would expect Boise State to be up there. And another team that might surprise, Oklahoma State. And so that's another game that Oregon has to go early on in the season, bringing back a lot of continuity. Dante Moore, a lot of their skilled position players are back, returning guys, replacing some of the coaching staff. Maybe that makes an impact early on in the season, but those games against Oklahoma State, against Boise State, they should be wins. And so then let's move on the list of where they go to play. Week 4 at USC. Ohio State, they go on the road to Ohio State. They play at Michigan State versus Washington. That's a 4-game stretch for them. At Ohio State versus Michigan, so at home versus Michigan. At Michigan State, and we say, okay, that should be an easy win. But sandwich in the middle of these other 3 games, at home versus Washington to end that 4-game stretch, that could be a tough one. So now if we're looking at Oregon, best case scenario is you run the table and you win all those games. Because we say that they're tough games, but if you're ready to win the national championship this year, which everyone thinks that you might be, you have to win them. So if Oregon comes out of there, wins 1 game or loses 1 game, loses 2 games, are they the number 1 going to the playoffs? Are they number 2? Because there's going to be some other competition. Georgia, as we get into our SEC breakdown now, and let's pull up right here. Here's who's favored to win and at least how they're favored to finish in the SEC going into 2026 according to ESPN's model. Georgia has won it 2 years in a row and 3 out of the past 4 years. Looking at them ranked at number 3, I think it's fair. They play in one of the toughest conferences in college football, probably the toughest conference. They have a head coach in Kirby Smart who has brought them to the playoffs now in 2 straight years, and he's won the SEC 3 out of the past 4. Now, when they've made it to the playoffs the past 2 years, losing to Notre Dame 23-10, losing to Ole Miss recently just last year 39-34. That's disappointing. It was an extremely winnable game last year, and the game against Notre Dame was maybe a little bit less close. But as far as the 12-team playoff is concerned, Kirby Smart has yet to win a game. So they are loaded this year. Again, on defense, they should be just as good. Unfortunately, the defense kind of let them down in the playoff game against Ole Miss. When you look at what that offense in Ole Miss was able to do, missing Lane Kiffin and all the drama surrounding them going into that game, they put up 39 points and they could not be stopped no matter what they wanted to do. Outside of that, though, the defense was really good. Averaged less than 300 yards per game and only 18 points allowed. It's a top 10 unit once again. The pass rush was an issue, and that was one of the biggest things that bit them in the butt when the playoffs came around. 6 defensive starters are back. The defensive line is really big. Listen to some of these sizes. 6'4", 320 pounds. 6'4", 310 pounds, and 6'4", 315. All 3 of those guys on the defensive line. They have a safety that they brought in from Auburn, or pass rusher that they brought in from Auburn. They have good safeties. They have cornerbacks that might be in the first. They might have 2 guys going in the first round in their cornerback room. So when you look at this defense, when you look at all those things, size on the defensive line, good guys in the secondary, I imagine Georgia is going to be just fine. This linebacker core is going to be really tough. And now when we go into their schedule, they play week 4 at home against Oklahoma, a team that you see in there in the poll. Week 6 on the road at Alabama. Circle that one, but Kirby Smart kind of owns Alabama in recent years. I would expect that to be an extremely competitive game. They go and they play at home against Auburn. We don't know what we're going to get out of Auburn for this year. I'm not sure if that will be much of a challenge. And then a bye week. They play at home against Florida. And Florida is one of those teams that we'll talk about for a moment. If we look at the poll for both the coaches and the AP, obviously Florida didn't make it. But they received 51 votes in the AP poll and 147 votes in the coaches poll. They were second place to Clemson in the AP poll and second place to Louisville in the coaches poll for the amount of votes received. So there's a lot of respect for the Florida team this year and what they're building. So that could be a tough game for Georgia as well because they're sandwiched in a couple of other games. They then go on the road against Ole Miss. They come back home, play Missouri, and then they wrap up the stretch at South Carolina. South Carolina, another team that a lot of people have as that potential top 25 sleeper. They aren't fully, people aren't willing to fully commit to South Carolina yet, but if you look at that offense and you look at the coordinator that they just brought in, I think there's a chance that they could cause some upsets. So for Georgia, they should probably win the SEC. They are definitely favored to win it, and that's the biggest thing, right? So when you say, here they are being ranked in that top 4 comfortably, I would expect that throughout the season. Number 4, though, is Notre Dame. For Notre Dame, they are a team that this is their year the same way when we talk about Oregon. They're yet to really make a ton of momentum in the college football playoffs, and obviously losing last year to Miami, losing a couple close games, not even making it to the playoffs, really hurt them. And so now the Notre Dame rule comes into effect. They are most likely making this playoff. And I believe Notre Dame is going to be the number 1 team when it's all said and done. The reason I believe this is because their schedule is honestly the easiest out of any of the teams that we're going to talk about today. They're going to start 6-0 unless they lose to a team like Wisconsin, Michigan State, or Purdue. They're not going to, not this year, not unless injuries really hit them hard or something catastrophic happens. CJ Carr and that defense over there are simply going to be too good. The offense, like I said, led by CJ Carr, a guy who is probably going in the first round of the NFL draft next year. They're going to start 6-0. And then are they number 1 in the at the polls at that point? Because Ohio State would have had to play Texas. They would have had to potentially play Iowa at that point. Oregon would have had to play USC. They're going to have to go on there and play Ohio State. So Notre Dame has as good of a chance as anyone to start strong. And then really, where's the loss on the schedule? At BYU? Maybe. Okay. I could give you that if there's a mental lapse. Notre Dame has the more talented roster by far. And then back-to-back home games, they're playing Navy at home, a team that a lot of coaches and the press think maybe could surprise. However, they are not at the level of Notre Dame. The circle, though, Miami. Is this the game they lose? I have a lot of respect for Mario Cristobal's team in Miami this year. We'll talk about them in just a moment. So it is possible that they lose that one. The other game, SMU, maybe. SMU is going to be up at the top of the ACC, but Notre Dame is going to be a team challenging for the national championship game. So I think there's just levels to it. And when we're talking Texas, they should really have all the answers this year, at least on offense. The defense, maybe there's a little bit of a question mark. It was still really good last year, the past 2 years. It did digress just a little bit. And so they bring in Will Muskamp, a guy who had a ton of success previously at Texas in the early 2000s, obviously leading a legendary defense for a lot of years before departing, going to coach in Florida, and then most recently at Georgia, helping out their defense over there. So this team should have all the makings on defense to be a top 10 unit. The defensive line is absolutely massive. We talked about defensive line on other teams, but listen to this. 6'5", 378-pound transfer from Arkansas, Ian Jaffard. He is going to be an absolute unit on there, and they need it because last year that was the biggest issue for this defense. They didn't have any sacks against Florida or Ohio State, and they lost both those games, and only 2 sacks against Georgia. So when you're playing the top teams, if you're not going to be able to pressure the quarterback, I worry about what Texas has to offer. They are loaded at every single position. They have maybe the best quarterback in the nation, a guy that if he proves himself this year, if he can bounce back and play like he did in the second half of last year, because he was extremely young last year. Arch Manning, people were hard on him, not living up to their expectations, but he still had a really good season playing in the SEC as a freshman. Look for him to bounce back now, surrounded by skill position players. It's going to be a good time over there in Texas. And let's run through some of the other teams in the top 25. Indiana, the defending champs. I think they're being disrespected a little bit having them at 6. They received 14 first place votes in the coaches poll, and I think that's extremely appropriate. I almost like their group better this year than I did last year. I didn't know Mendoza was going to be who he was. The skill position group should be loaded. They have Turbo Richard over there at running back. They have a quarterback transfer in Josh Hoover. They have guys on the offensive line and the defensive line that should be absolute killers, and that's why they're at 6th overall. A 6-0 start is certainly not out of the question for this Indiana team, and then it starts to get difficult. 5-game stretch, home against Ohio State, on the road against Michigan, home against Minnesota, a team that's always fairly competitive, home against USC, that could be an interesting one, and then on the road at Washington. So for Indiana, look for them to really have that 5-game stretch determine where they're going to sit, but they are for sure starting the season 6-0, 5-1 in the worst case, and they're going to put themselves right back in contention for the college football playoffs and the national championship because counting out Curt Cignetti is a mistake. Number 7, Miami, another team that maybe is being overlooked a little bit. They could probably win the ACC with their eyes closed this year. Their toughest games at Clemson, week 5, maybe Dabo's team goes out there and surprises. When we look at the AP poll, you don't see Clemson in the AP poll. However, they got 112 votes. They were the first team out, essentially, so they would be ranked number 26 if we were to have it for them. And then when you look at the coaches, they actually gave Clemson a lot of respect. They have them firmly there in the rankings, and that's what I think when you're looking at a team led by Dabo Swinney. They actually hit the transfer portal decently hard this year, so Clemson might end up being a tough game for Miami. Outside of that, obviously November 7th, they go at Notre Dame, and then November 14th, back-to-back weeks, they're playing a home game against Duke, the team that won the ACC last year. Duke did have to reload. I'm not entirely sold on their roster this year. They lost a lot of talent, including their top quarterback and wide receiver who went to Miami. So that game's going to be one that you circle because Miami is probably going to go out there and blow them out by 30 points unless that Duke defense is ready to get back at their former quarterback. Moving up the list, you see Texas A&M and Ole Miss back to back there. Obviously for Ole Miss, they're going to be hit pretty hard this year. They are returning a lot of talent still. They're returning talent at quarterback on the offensive side of the ball, so that's going to make a massive difference. But when I was breaking down where a lot of these teams got their talent from, Ole Miss was coming up a lot, and especially with LSU. A lot of Lane's guys did go with him, even if it wasn't the quarterback specifically. And Ole Miss, they're going to play Louisville in week 3, and then they have to play, or they're going to play Louisville to start the season. Then week 3, they have to play at home against LSU. That's going to be the game that you circle. At home against Lane Kiffin, coming back to LSU. They're going to have to go on the road to Florida, on the road to Vanderbilt, for at home against Missouri, on the road at Texas, home game against Georgia, and on the road, Oklahoma. So I'm a little bit worried about this Ole Miss team. Obviously, they were able to rally last year in the playoffs around that team, missing their coach, missing all of that turnover that was happening. But I think the wheels might fall off, especially when they start to play some of the more difficult teams in the second half of the schedule. If they lose the game against LSU and then maybe that game against Florida or one of them against Missouri, do they go out there and win 2 out of the 3 games against Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma? Or are we looking at another 9-3 team in the SEC? Texas A&M, a team that we need to talk about in a little bit more detail. They're having third-year head coach Mike Elko, returning quarterback Marcel Reed, a guy that has all the talent in the world, and unfortunately for him, he just needs to cut down on the turnovers. 12 interceptions last year, and that's what had him at 7th in total QBR. So if Texas A&M can be a little bit cleaner on the offensive side of the ball, a team that was able to go to the college football playoffs last year and return a massive amount of talent this year. Unfortunately, losing Casey Conception to the NFL draft, a wide receiver, a guy who was extremely talented. They did load up in the portal, and they have some playmakers. Mario Crayer, a guy that you will recognize his name when he starts to play on Saturdays, because he has all the talent in the world there. Returning running back in Ruben Owens, obviously returning quarterback Marcel Reed. They should be just fine. They hit the transfer portal to load up with a lot of depth on their offensive and defensive line. They should have a really good defense again. 7 players were drafted for them, so that does hurt the depth overall. They lost 6 out of their 7 top offensive linemen from last year and 5 out of their 7 defensive linemen. That is tough. And now when we're looking at the schedule for Texas A&M, there is a lot of difficult games. For them, maybe these games might not be too bad. At home against Arizona State University, at home against Kentucky, probably winnable games, but you never know. If you're having a little bit of turnover on the offensive and the defensive lines, maybe those could be opportunities for an upset. The biggest games, though, at LSU, at Missouri, and then for them at Alabama, bye week, at South Carolina, home against Tennessee, at Oklahoma, and then the Red River shootout, the Red River rivalry against Texas. So that is going to be a tough stretch. So when we look at Texas A&M, a ton of turnover, they have all the talent in the world. I see 4 losses on this schedule, and I think that's going to drop them out of the top 12. I do see them being a top 20 team and potentially battling up there in the SEC. If you're looking at the projection, there's a lot of models that are high on Texas A&M this year. So if they go out there and upset a couple of those teams, you could see Texas A&M as a team right back there in the college football playoffs. And then the last team that we'll talk about, at least for now, because you've all sat with me long enough, make sure that you tune into our dedicated videos later on in the week because I want to talk more. LSU, the team led by Lane Kiffin, obviously all of the drama surrounding how he got to LSU. Leaving Ole Miss before the college football playoff game and trying to recruit coordinators and players while it's happening. And again, for Lane Kiffin, he went and he got paid. He has won at every single place he's ever been. So as much as we want to criticize his decision and his choice to leave in the way that he left, Kiffin is a winner. At FAU, for 5 out of the 6 years before he got there, they didn't win more than 3 games. When Lane got there, 2 out of his 3 seasons, they won 11 games. Since then, they haven't won 5 games. Since Lane Kiffin left them years ago. Then he goes over there at USC, when he was at USC before there, he obviously had the whole Reggie Bush scandal, all that stuff, and he still won 10 games. When he was with Tennessee, he only played or he only coached one season there, but for them, they hadn't had a winning season in 6 seasons, and he delivered them a winning season. And then he turned Ole Miss into a contender. He has people believing that Ole Miss is a top 15 team in the nation. And maybe they will be. Maybe I'm being too hard on them. But a lot of that was the Lane Kiffin effect and his offensive coordinator, in my opinion. A team in Ole Miss that was able to run the ball extremely effectively in the past couple of years, and now coming over to a team in LSU that couldn't run the ball for crap last year. So in Lane Kiffin's system, that is going to change. Man, did they open up the checkbook. They went out there and paid players. Sam Leavitt, the number one quarterback in the portal, the guy that everybody wanted from Arizona State University, he has come over to be the starter. You saw what Lane Kiffin was able to do with guys like Jackson Dart. He is extremely excited to have his playmaker in Sam Leavitt, a guy who is responsible with the ball, but who can push it downfield. You might see him in conversation for the Heisman because he can run and he can pass, and that's big in Lane's system. Jackson Dart, the guy we mentioned, when he had him at Ole Miss, they made plays in the run game and in the pass game. They got extremely creative. LSU paid wide receiver transfers. And man, it's almost unfair how explosive this wide receiver room is. 3 wide receivers that they brought in averaged more than 17 yards per reception last year. With a big play offense, a guy led by Sam Leavitt who is extremely accurate. He's coming off of a foot injury, so you have to watch that. But all reports out of camp are that he's moving around just fine and he should be great. And then after we've talked about all of that, the offensive line is going to really help. It's loaded. They actually brought in the number one offensive line transfer, in my opinion at least, a guy from Colorado, a big loss for the Buffaloes. He's coming over. He's massive. He's going to make a big difference. And then tight end, J.C. Anderson, 6'6", 256 pounds at tight end. This guy in the red zone is going to catch a lot of touchdowns, and I guarantee you J.C. Anderson is going the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft because he's going to score 10 touchdowns this year, maybe more. Blake Baker, a guy who is a defensive coordinator who has been successful at LSU, minus their bowl game last year when a bunch of guys had already decided they were transferring out. He had a really good defense. And now with the amount of money that they spent, we talked about it on offense. They might have spent more money on defense. The defensive line is absolutely stacked now. And so for them, already coming off of a team last year that on defense, they were the number one in the red zone. Teams scored just 74% of the time against them. They should have a lot of size. They should have a lot of speed. And now let's look at their schedule. Weeks 3 and 4 at Ole Miss. That's going to be a big game. Everyone's going to be extremely fired up, but so will LSU. There's a lot of talent on that LSU side that came over from Ole Miss. I would expect that to be a big game for the side of the Tigers and also for the Rebels. Week 1, they do open the season against Clemson. Maybe if LSU is not ready to play and if Dabo has his guys ready and good to go, they're at least LSU's at home. That's the big equalizer. I think it's going to favor them. That could be a potential upset. I don't see it though. The biggest games though, weeks 3 and 4, at Ole Miss, and then at home against Texas A&M. Those are going to determine it because then they're stretched between November 7th and November 21st, 3 straight weeks, home against Alabama, home against Texas, at Tennessee. So we look at LSU. If they have 3 losses, what are we doing here? Because I can comfortably see when I look at these team schedules, I didn't even talk about some of the other teams that we have on this schedule list. There's so much more that will break down as we get into it because a team like USC, what if they end up having 3 losses? A team like Washington, Michigan, BYU, Alabama, Texas Tech. You're going to have to tune in for the breakdown. Now let's throw back to you, SamCentre, on the desk. Thank you, Coach Sam. Excellent breakdown as always, and this is why we tell you in the intro, you need to turn on notifications, be subscribed to the channel, because he's going to be back breaking down the SEC in greater detail. breaking down his predictions for the college football playoffs and ultimately the national championship winner. Every week, we're going to talk the games week 0 starting next weekend, Saturday, the 29th. I cannot wait. And then obviously, NFL week 1 is right around the corner. But for now, we have CFL, Canadian Football League, to talk. Let's see our power rankings heading into week 12. A little bit of movement, as you can see. The Alouettes remain at the top, and I don't expect that to change with their matchup this week at home against Ottawa. To me, it's quite clear Montreal is the top dog in the league, and in the West, things got a little bit more competitive. With Saskatchewan losing and with Edmonton blowing out Toronto, I think it's fair to say that Edmonton has cemented number 2 in the West, but obviously a loss for Calgary, a win for BC, and for Winnipeg, things are moving a little bit in the standings. And I can't wait to chat about that as we head into the week. Let's just take a moment to pause, look at where teams are at. Obviously, Ottawa still winless. There's a logjam of teams over here in the West. And here's what we talk about with the crossover. If you're new to the Canadian Football League, let me explain it for just a moment. Due to the imbalance in the amount of teams in each league, we have something called a crossover. If the fourth place team in the West has a better record than the third place team in the East, then that team crosses over and plays the second place team in the East. Obviously, things can happen in different ways. If the fourth place team in the East just so happened to be better than the third place team in the West, you could cross over in a different way. But with the extra team in the Western Conference, oftentimes it happens that way. And it's a way for one of these teams to be able to make the playoffs. So that's why it's extremely important when we talk about BC getting that win, clawing back to 4-5, Calgary dropping the ball. A couple games back to back where they're really hurting themselves. That's why if we pull up the power rankings just one more time, I do still believe in Calgary. I think with better decision making, hopefully Mills and Adams aren't out for the long term because that's going to be the big equalizer. If they are, and if they're going to miss serious amount of time, then I'm going to drop them much, much lower in the power rankings. But as far as what I saw, that team was still competitive despite all of the noise. They really should have 3 or 4 more wins on their record. Now they're entering a stretch that's extremely important. They're obviously going to have to head to Edmonton and host Edmonton, Labor Day Classic, Labor Day rematch. That's going to be massive for the standings in the Western Conference. But we've chatted enough about that. Let's talk the Week 12 matchups. Calgary being on a bye. That's why I still had them there. I think there's hope that they could heal up. Adams and Mills can maybe get back in the win column when they're returning in Week 13. But Ottawa is heading over to Montreal, the game we talked about. Official prediction is going to be Montreal beating Ottawa by a score of 38-18. It looks like, as far as Montreal is concerned, they've sold over 20,000 tickets already, which means it will most likely be a sold-out crowd. They'll be rocking off a bye week. I don't expect Davis Alexander and that team to have any bit of letdown. 38-18 for the Alouettes. Friday's game, Edmonton hosting Winnipeg. A game that I believe Edmonton is going to make a statement and show that they are much better than Winnipeg. 29-21. I think Winnipeg definitely has a chance if they can build off of some of their momentum. If Zach Collaros can get another week of practice under his belt, be back healthy, ready to go, I think it could be maybe a close game. The Edmonton pass rush and defensive line is going to cause havoc. I guarantee you there's going to be multiple turnovers for the Winnipeg offense caused by the pressure on the Edmonton defensive line. I'm not entirely sold on Edmonton being able to score a bunch of points on Winnipeg, so maybe that's why we'll say it's going to remain close, 29-21, with Cody Fajardo passing for 2 touchdowns. Saturday, Hamilton goes to Toronto, a rematch of a game that we saw just a couple weeks ago, where Toronto is going to be kicking themselves for losing that. And that's going to be our prediction. I'm going to say on the flip side, Toronto wins 27-24 on the strength of some much better kicking. But for Hamilton, building off of the momentum of the win against Saskatchewan last week, the comeback win in the fourth quarter, maybe you have something here. It seems like the duel of Harrison Frost and Trey Ford might be able to work. Trey Ford is not a great quarterback when it comes to taking shots down the field and those sort of things. But when you put him in the offensive zone, in the red zone past maybe the 40 on the opposing team's yardage, he can do a lot of damage. So look for Hamilton to deploy both quarterbacks in this game, and I still think they're going to lose it at Toronto 27-24. The final game of the week on Sunday, a Saskatchewan Roughriders team that obviously dropped a game at Hamilton last week, a game that they were in control of until the fourth quarter collapse. And they're going to be kicking themselves. I would bet anything that Corey Mace has his guys ready to go, and it's going to be an extremely competitive game at BC. However, they have a lot of injuries, whereas BC is starting to get healthy, and they realize this is where the season is on the line for the Lions. They see how competitive it is if we pull up the standings one more time in the CFL. They know that winning this game against Saskatchewan could be key, and as much as the Riders don't want to say it, they know that they're hurting right now. If they can get back healthy, make a late season push, they're probably going to be okay. So the official prediction for this game, 31-28 for the BC Lions. Look for Nathan Rourke to finally have a game where he is showing that he's back and that the BC Lions are ready to compete again in the Western Conference. And we'll see if our predictions came true, obviously, when it comes around to our Victory Monday show. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I would really enjoy it if you hit the subscribe button, like the video, leave me a comment down below, let Coach Sam know. What was his breakdown like? Do you think that he was right about the 4 SEC teams? Do you think that he's missing out? Is Alabama, is Ole Miss, is Oklahoma going to come out of the woodworks and surprise this year? We want to hear from you in the comments. As always, we'll be back on Friday breaking down UFC Sacramento, a card highlighted by Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, Gregory Robocop Rodriguez. I cannot wait to get into all of the action. And SamCentre out.